Welcome to the very first inaugural Ichiban #1 Bonsai Network Podcast. I am your host, Bjorn, and I'm very excited that you've chosen to join me on this new adventure. This is something that I've been wanting to do for many years, and I'm finally in a position to do it now that I've settled back in the US, and I'm very excited that you've decided to join me here. So what I'd like to do with this very first podcast is explain to you a little bit about the format of the podcast, what I hope to accomplish with it going forward, potential guests that we're going to be having in the future. And then I want to get into kind of my history, my background as a bonsai professional, so you are more aware and up to date as to where I'm coming from and my perspective on bonsai art. First things first, I want to talk a little bit about the name of the podcast, the Bonsai Network, kind of why I decided to go with this name. It's a very simple name, almost an obvious name, but in my opinion, these days around the world, the bonsai community is growing by leaps and bounds for many different reasons, and of course we'll get into all of that throughout the course of future podcasts. But I think because this community is growing so rapidly and so quickly, we're starting to see this wonderful world network of bonsai professionals, bonsai hobbyists, practitioners, people in general who just love the art of bonsai. So my goal with this podcast is to bring that community together through this type of format where we discuss bonsai art, we discuss topics surrounding bonsai. That could be anything from horticulture to cultural influences that influence each of us in the way that we practice bonsai and our approach to the art. And of course, we'll get into the stories behind the people who are creating today's top bonsai art around the world. Now, what I do, for those of you who don't know, is I travel around the world quite regularly to work with different private collections, to work with different public collections. So I get to interact with a lot of really unique and interesting people in the bonsai community from all parts of the world. So it's my goal with this podcast as I travel to find opportunities to interview some of these people, to talk to them about their experiences in bonsai, and hopefully to bring about a larger conversation about the art. And one thing I want to be fully keen on and fully aware of as I ask these questions and interview folks from around the world, and as we have this discussion between you and I here on the podcast, I want to make sure that I discuss my own personal biases, where I've learned what has influenced me in the way that I approach bonsai, and perhaps to open my own personal mind in new directions. So I'm hoping that this conversation from my end will help me out in that regard, and I'm hoping that it helps you sort of address your personal biases as well, open your mind, and learn about bonsai from new perspectives from folks all around the world. So essentially, the Bonsai Network podcast is going to function as a conduit for all of us to have a conversation about the art and for us to learn from each other and learn from these cultural influences that are impacting the way that each of us design and create and interpret our trees. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into my background in bonsai art so that you know where I'm coming from and my personal perspective as of right now. So it's probably best to go all the way back to the very beginning. So I want to tell you a little bit about my story right from the start. So I used to do karate from elementary school through high school, and it was a huge part of my life. When I was about 12 years old, I was introduced to the Karate Kid movies. I know a lot of people who do bonsai art as a hobby now. That was their first introduction to the art, and it was the same for me. So I remember watching the Karate Kid movies in my folks' basement when I was 12 and thinking, man, this is really cool. That those little trees are kind of interesting. So for my 13th birthday, I asked my parents if they could get me a bonsai, and they did. So they ended up getting me one of those little junipers from the local Home Depot or Home and Garden Center, and it was one of those that was probably already dead when they bought it. You know, it'd been spray painted with the green color for the foliage, and the rocks had been glued on the surface of the soil, so it was probably dead once I received it, but I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. So I kept it on my nightstand next to my bed for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it really did start to turn kind of a brownish color. And by the end of that month, it was completely dead, and the needles had started to fall off. So despite the fact that that tree died almost immediately after I received it, I was completely hooked at that point. So I asked my folks for another tree, and I got another one by the end of that same summer. It was a little banyan ficus. It actually came from South Carolina, I believe. But I kept that tree. I actually kept that tree for, I don't know, probably a good 10, 12 years. after I first received it. So second one stayed alive, and at that point, I was completely hooked. So little by little, I started adding a few trees here and there to my collection, mostly stuff that I would collect out of my folks' yard or throw away stuff from the burn pile at some of our local nurseries in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I was born and raised. So that made up a majority of my collection. And all through high school, as I was continuing to do karate and of course working on my studies, I was doing bonsai as a hobby on the side. And I don't think that folks realized, or my friends realized, just how obsessed I was with the art. I think a few of them probably did, because I would carry bonsai books around at school with me. And during the lunch break, or when I could sneak away for a bathroom break, I'd take one of those little books into the bathroom with me and read it. So a few of my friends were aware that I was doing that, but for the most part, I was keeping it on the down low, so I didn't get bullied too much. So I mean, I was a little bit of a short, chubby kid back in those days, and played trombone in the marching band. So that did not really help my social status, and taking bonsai books to school really would not have been good if I had been discovered by other folks who were already bullying me. So, so for those of you who don't know, I'm 6'5", about 2 meters tall now. So I'm a little bit different than I was back in those days, but it took some growing during high school and after high school to get to this point. So back to the story. During my sophomore year of high school, I applied for a local program through Panasonic headquarters that we had in Knoxville, Tennessee. Every year, Panasonic would offer for high school students from the Knox County area where I was from a 2-week cultural exchange program trip to Japan, all expenses paid. But you had to go through an interview process and write an essay and be chosen for this exchange program. So my sophomore year of high school, I applied for that program, went through the whole process, and I was chosen to go. So in the summer after my sophomore year, I guess I was 15 or 16, probably 16 at the time, I got to go to Japan for the very first time. So the first half of the trip, Panasonic kind of shuttled us all around Japan to different places. We got to see a lot of the cultural sites, including Kyoto. We went to Hiroshima and Miyajima. And then when we were in Miyajima, this was about a week and a half into the 2-week trip, I saw the very first bonsai in Japan that I'd seen on the whole trip. It was actually in some little old grandpa's front garden, basically. I was out walking early in the morning to go look at the shrine, the very famous shrine that's there out in the bay, and I just happened out of the corner of my eye to see this little bitty garden with a few bonsai trees in it. So I kind of poked my head in, knocked on the door, and the little old grandpa guy came out, and I, of course I couldn't speak Japanese at that time, and he didn't really speak English, but we had a few common words. I knew how to say bonsai. I knew a few of the Japanese words for the styles and species of trees, so we were able to kind of point and grunt and laugh and communicate that way. So that was my first introduction to bonsai in Japan, and I was so excited. I thought, if I could see even just one tree on the whole 2-week trip, I would be completely satisfied. The trip would have been totally worth it at that point. But he happened to have a whole garden full of trees, so spent probably a good hour there talking to him, looking at his plants. And now that I think back on it, the trees probably weren't the best quality trees, but there was just something magical about actually seeing trees in Japan for the very first time. So after that, we as a group went back up to Osaka, which is where the main Panasonic headquarters are in the Kansai region there. And the Panasonic headquarters, they sort of threw each of us separately into a host family situation for the last couple nights that we were there. So the first night that I got to my host family's home, they didn't speak a word of English, and of course I didn't speak any Japanese then. So we ended up sort of just sitting on the couch and staring at a blank TV. Nobody really said anything. It was super, super awkward. But during that process of sitting there and kind of looking at each other, twiddling our thumbs, the host dad managed to ask me if I had any hobbies. So I mentioned bonsai, and his eyes lit up. So it wasn't that he was into bonsai himself. It was simply that there was a common word. There was something that I could say that he could understand, and that he could say that I could understand. So we'd found this mutual word to work off of. So went to bed that night, and the next morning I got up, and the whole host family, they had prepared breakfast for me. So we had breakfast as we were sitting there. The host father said something about going to a bonsai garden. He just kept saying bonsai garden. And I said, oh, okay, bonsai garden, bonsai garden. So we got in the car after breakfast, drove probably 45 minutes or so, still within Osaka. And we rounded this corner, and I saw this fenced-in area with a bunch of green sort of sticking out over the top of the fence. And my heart started racing. I started thinking, oh, holy crap, are we actually going to see a real bonsai nursery? And as we pulled up, the gate opened, and we walked in, and it was like heaven. It was this amazing bonsai garden full of the best trees I had ever seen in my life up to that point. Just incredible, incredible plants. And, of course, I had been doing bonsai at that point. What's that? I started when I was basically 13. I was 16 then, so about 3 years or so. So I had kind of a basic understanding of what good trees were, but I'd never seen them in person. So to actually walk into this garden and see these fantastic trees, I don't think I really understood exactly how good those trees were at that time. But anyway, we were walking through the garden, and all of a sudden I heard this loud voice that said, "Konnichiwa." And I turned around, and it was a middle-aged, probably early 40s or so, Japanese man. And he came out and introduced himself. Of course, he didn't speak any English either, but he and the host dad that I was with, they communicated a little bit. I believe that the host dad sort of explained who I was, why I was there, that I was interested in bonsai. So the fella who owned the nursery came over to me at that point, introduced himself, and he said that his name was Fujikawa. So I asked if I could see his business card. He gave me his business card, and it was Keiichi Fujikawa was the name of this particular individual. And at the time, I think he was very interested in the fact that some 16-year-old kid from the U.S. was interested in bonsai. So he sort of made a joke and said, we don't really have that many apprentices here in Japan at this point. So if in the future you ever want to come back and become an apprentice, be more than happy to have you here. So I took it seriously. I thought it was the most amazing thing in the world, but I think he was joking at the time. But in any case, I stuck the business card into my pocket and took it home and actually laminated it and kept it for years after I'd initially met him. So, little did he know at that time that particular offer to me would influence the rest of my life, because I always kept in the back of my mind that there's an offer to be an apprentice in Japan, and this is something that I think I can do. So I just had to figure out how to do that, how to get back to Japan. So moving forward a few years later, I finished high school and went to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And at the University of Tennessee, they have a Japanese language major, but I didn't really think that doing full-on Japanese language as a major would be a very beneficial major to do, because in the event that I couldn't get back to Japan to do the apprenticeship, I thought that perhaps that particular degree would have been a bit of a waste. So what I did, I ended up doing a dual business and Japanese language degree at the University of Tennessee. And that allowed me to study Japanese while also getting a business degree that I thought would be much more useful, much more beneficial in the future. Now, one interesting thing about this particular type of degree is that in order to fulfill the language component of the degree, you actually have to go to the country where that language is native or natively spoken. So I knew this going into it, and I thought this is a fantastic opportunity. I can get a degree, I can get a business degree, I can learn Japanese, and I have to go back to Japan for a year. This is perfect. So for my junior year of university, I guess I was 20 at the time, I went back to Japan to study as a language major in Japan for a year. And I ended up getting placed at a brand new school. Well, the school itself wasn't brand new. It was a brand new tie with the University of Tennessee at the time. It was a school called Ritsumeikan University, which is up in the northwest corner of Kyoto, just under Kinugasa Mountain, which is where Roanji, which is the famous Kare Sansui, or a lot of people call it Zen rock garden, is. I recommend, if you haven't been there, if you haven't looked it up, check it out. It's Roanji. And then, of course, Kinkakuji, which is the Golden Pavilion, is also right in that same area. So it's a beautiful area of Kyoto. So I lucked out and got placed at this school that we had brand new ties with the University of Tennessee. And while I was there, many things over the course of my life have come out of, many good things have come out of my involvement in bonsai. And one of those really good things is meeting my wife. I actually met my wife. Many of you know her from my vlogs online, Nancy. People here call her Nancy. She was a 4-year student at that same Ritsumeikan University. So within 2 weeks of arriving at that university, I met her. She had actually signed up for the buddy program at the university to help out the new exchange students who were coming over from overseas. So she was part of that program. We ended up meeting, and then within a couple of months, we started dating. And as I record this podcast, that was just a little over 11 years ago. So we've been together a very long time, been married for almost 5 years at this point. But that was another great thing that came out of my involvement in bonsai. But back to the bonsai story. So while I was at the university in Kyoto, so Ritsumeikan University, I took a couple of opportunities to go visit Fujikawa-san's nursery. Every time I would go down there, though, he was never there. So, and I was too afraid to give him a call at that point or write him a message because my Japanese still was absolutely terrible. For those of you who don't know, if you study a language at a university in the States, particularly an Asian language where the writing system is different from typical Roman characters, most of your education is going to revolve around learning how to read and write and not learn about speaking, really. So when I actually got to Japan for that junior year of school, I had no speaking skills whatsoever. So I was too nervous to call Fujikawa-san, too nervous to write him. So I just opted to go down and visit during what I thought would be business hours. But he was always gone. He was always out somewhere. So I missed him both times that I went down there. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go to the Taikon 10, which is a big exhibition in Kyoto in November. So I joined up with Bill Valvanis. I know a lot of you know who Bill is, a pioneer of bonsai in the U.S. up in New York. He runs a tour every year for the Taikon 10. So I asked if I could join him for part of that and tour the show with him. So he was kind enough to allow me to do that. So I joined him, went through the exhibition, and when I walked out to the sales area, the vendors area, I saw Fujikawa-san, and I immediately panicked. I had no idea. In my mind, I thought I knew what I was going to say, but as soon as I saw him, I realized I should have prepared a little bit better. So I freaked out, didn't say anything, just sort of skirted by him, didn't talk to him, didn't show my face or anything. I was way too nervous. So I missed that opportunity, and as soon as that was over, I completely regretted it, 100%. I knew that I should have said something to him, I should have communicated to him, but I didn't. So a few months later, in February of, what year would that have been, 2007, I asked Bill if I could join part of his tour for the Kokufu, which is in February in Tokyo. And again, he obliged and said, sure, you can come along as long as you provide a little bit of translation service. So I did that to the best of my ability at that particular time, which of course wasn't great, but I tried my best. And when we got to the Kokufu at the Green Club, which is the area where all of the bonsai nurserymen set up as vendors, I saw Fujikawa-san there. And I thought, okay, this time I'm not going to miss this opportunity to talk to him. In the back of my head, I had thought that for sure he would remember me because I was probably one of the only American young people that had ever come to his nursery. And of course, I remembered him deeply, and I really wanted to speak to him again. So I got my confidence up. I walked over to him and said hello in Japanese. And he turned and looked at me and had this kind of dubious look in his eye. He had no idea who I was. I could tell just by looking at his face. He was like, what the hell is this American kid talking to me for? I'm sure my pronunciation was terrible then too. So I'm sure he was thinking, my God, this kid he sounds terrible in Japanese. I know I can't communicate with him, so why even bother? But I tried my best. I introduced myself and I said, I don't know if you remember, but a few years back, I came to your nursery when I was 16, just for a couple hours one morning to visit. And he looked at me, and he had this kind of puzzled look on his face. And He said, were you wearing really, really short shorts when you came? And I said, well, I was probably wearing shorts because it was July. He said, yeah, I vaguely remember you. And at that point, I was completely devastated. I thought, oh my God, I thought I had made an impact on him. I thought, for sure he had made an impact on me. I thought we had this mutual bond. He offered me this apprenticeship if I ever wanted to come back. And then meeting him again, I realized he had no idea who I was. It was probably just a joke that he had offered me that apprenticeship. So I was totally devastated. But we finished the conversation. I said nothing about doing an apprenticeship at his place at that point, and basically just walked away, totally defeated. So about 6 months after that, I came back to the States after I finished my year in Japan, and I decided that, you know what, I want to go back to Japan. I want to do this apprenticeship. Out of all the nurseries that I visited while I was in Japan, Fujikawa-san's was the one that spoke to me the most. The style of the trees was fantastic. His general attitude, I thought, was fantastic. The location was great because Nancy was living in Kyoto. This nursery was in Osaka. So I could easily live in Osaka, work at the nursery, and still see her on occasion because it's only about a 45 minutes to an hour train ride apart. So all of these things aligned, and I thought, this is perfect. I really want to become an apprentice at Fujikawa-san's nursery. The next question was, how do I go about doing that? So my final year of university at the University of Tennessee, I started to write Fujikawa-san letters, actually emails. So I got on his website. He was one of the only people at the time, only bonsai nurserymen who had a website. So I got on his website and sent him a message. I wrote it out in Japanese, and I'd actually made a few friends at the University of Tennessee that last year who were from Japan. So I got one of them to check my Japanese writing, and he totally ripped my letter apart, which was a good thing because if I had sent the original one, it probably didn't make much sense, and Fujikawa-san would have completely ignored it. So I got my friend to check it, correct it for me, and then I sent that off to him via email. And it took about 2 months of hearing nothing. And I thought, okay, well, this kind of sucks. Well, maybe you didn't get the first one. So I wrote another one and sent it to the email. About a month goes by, I didn't hear anything again. So I sent another one. And then I started to send them a bit more frequently, about once a week for about a 4-week period. And finally, I got a message back. Now, of course, all of the emails that I had sent were quite long, very detailed. And the response I got back from Fujikawa-san was, I think your Japanese sucks. I don't think that young Americans are going to work hard enough or have the work ethic to be successful as a bonsai apprentice. So I'm not going to take you as an apprentice. And I was completely devastated at that point. I couldn't believe that was the response. It was like a 2-sentence response, and essentially it said no. So I wrote him another letter and another letter and another letter, and he finally wrote me back again and said, okay, look, I can tell that you want to do this, that you seem dedicated to the process, but I want to explain fully what I expect of you if you come here as an apprentice. So at that point, I was super excited. My heart was about to beat out of my chest after reading just the first sentence of that next letter from him. And as I get into the letter, he starts explaining, okay, look, if you want to come over and be an apprentice, here's how it works. I'm not going to provide you a visa. You have to come over just on your passport. That gives you a 90-day period where you can basically have a trial period at the nursery to make sure that I like you, as in Fujikawa-san likes me, and that my personality meshes well with his, and that he understands my work ethic, and that I understand the work ethic that is expected of me. So at that point, I said, okay, this is perfect. I'm going to go back to Japan as soon as I graduate, and I'm going to do this 3-month trial. So that's exactly what I did. So 2 weeks after graduation in May of 2008, I went right back to Japan and started my 3-month trial period. So it was an interesting start because I lived in Japan for a year for the study abroad, but everything was essentially taken care of during that year. Meaning, before I went, the university had prepared a student dorm for me to stay in. All of the insurance was taken care of. I had scholarship funds that were covering my expenses there, so everything was taken care of. But when I went back for my trial period for the apprenticeship, none of that was taken care of. So as soon as I landed, it was a scramble to find an apartment. I wanted to find something, and Fujikawa-san wanted to find something that was close to the nursery because I needed to be on call all the time as an apprentice. So we ended up finding something that was very old. It was only about $280 or $300 US dollars per month, so quite cheap. Luckily, it was actually quite a big place. It was simply cheap because it was so old. But it ran, or there was a river that ran just outside of it, so it had a decent view, if you can call it that. I guess it was a man-made river, so it was concrete on both sides, but still it was a river. So I had a little bit of a view, and two of the rooms were tatami mat floors, which were, that was really cool. It was like living the true Japanese cultural experience. So I was excited about that. So we got this apartment, we got it all set up. And the agreement that Fujikawa-san and I had was that because he didn't have a facility on the property for me to stay, what he would do would be to pay for the apartment, and then I would receive just a few $100s for food every month. So essentially room and board is what I received as an apprentice. This is pretty typical in Japan for most apprenticeships in bonsai. Although some nurseries do offer actual room to their apprentices on the property. It's just that at Fujikawa-san's nursery, there wasn't room there. So he got this separate apartment for me. So I stayed in this apartment, and I would commute by bicycle. They call them mamachari in Japanese. It's basically just your standard bicycle, no gears or anything. There's a basket on the front with a little bell that you can flick with your thumb. So, I'm 6'5", and I'm riding on a mamachari bicycle that's made for like a 5'2" Japanese woman. So I look pretty ridiculous. And as a matter of fact, I broke many, many, many mamachari bikes during my apprenticeship because I weighed, at that point I was like 90 kilograms, 95 kilograms, so just over 200 pounds. So, those bikes are made for women who are like, 55 kilograms, so about half my size. So I bent the wheels and the handlebars on many mamachari during my apprenticeship. But I would commute every day to the nursery. It was about a 3-minute bike ride to the nursery. And during that 3-month trial period, the whole point again was for Fujikawa-san to see if my work ethic matched what was expected of me at the nursery. So, typically the nursery would open at 8, and we'd stay open depending on the time of year, stay open till 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight. It just depended on the time of year and how busy we were at that given time. But because the nursery opened at 8, I would show up every day between 7 and 7:30, and without really being asked to do so, I figured that I needed to clean the nursery. I needed to get everything looking in tip-top shape. So that's what I would do. I'd show up early. I would sweep the entire nursery. I'd weed any new weeds that had come up from the previous day. I'd clean all the tea bowls, the dishes from the previous day. When customers would visit, we'd always put out tea for them. So we'd have tons of teacups all over the tea room. So I'd clean those up the next morning and just generally prepare the nursery for the day to start. So that's what I would do every morning, get up very early and go. And at this stage, I was the only apprentice at the nursery. And by the way, the nursery's name is Kouka-en, Kouka-en. It translates to light flower nursery. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the history of the nursery here shortly. But back to the trial period. So during this trial period, I was the only apprentice there, and I was Fujikawa-san's first apprentice. So it was a bit of a learning curve, obviously for me, a very steep learning curve, and a learning curve for Fujikawa-san as well, because he had never had an apprentice, and his only experience with apprenticeship was his apprenticeship, which he had done in the late 80s at Bonsai-en, which is Saburo Kato's nursery up in the Omiya Bonsai Village. If you don't know Saburo Kato, he is considered sort of one of the kind of founding fathers of modern bonsai in Japan. Very interesting fellow. I got to meet him a few times before he passed away, but very, very interesting guy. But Fujikawa-san, my teacher, my oyakata, studied under Saburo Kato in the late 80s for about 6 years. So learning from sort of how Saburo Kato approached his apprentices, Fujikawa-san approached me in the same way, meaning that Mr. Kato was sort of, it was kind of like a grandfatherly figure, a fatherly figure to the apprentices. So, of course, he was very strict when it came to work, very strict when it came to apprentice life, but he wasn't abusive mentally or physically, which is the case at a lot of other nurseries in Japan. Maybe not so much today, but certainly back in the 80s and early 90s. So because Fujikawa-san was treated that way, he treated me the same way. However, because I was his only and first apprentice, he kind of went all in on certain things. So looking back on how he treated me then versus how he treats the new apprentices that we now have coming into Koken today, I see a vast difference in approach. So he was much stricter with me back then than he is with the new guys at the nursery now. He still demands a lot from them, but his attitude is a little different. I think part of that is he's gotten older over the last 10 years or so. And kind of calmed down might be the nice way to say it, or mellowed out, perhaps. So his approach is a little bit different. But for me, it was he was on my back, on my case all the time about everything, and I think that was a good thing at the time. I knew going into it that was something I should expect, but I didn't know to what degree, and if it would be a sustained approach on Fujikawa-san's part towards me. But of course, it ended up, being that way, and I'm forever grateful that was the case, because during that period, I think this is true for a lot of people coming out of university in their 20s. It's this period of flux where it's really hard to adjust from going from a university life where you have some responsibility, but not a lot. Most folks are supported by scholarship or by their folks during that period, and then being out on your own and 100% having to take care of yourself. And on top of that, being thrown into a cultural situation that's completely different from your own just compounded the problem for me. So that whole first year, I had this kind of romantic vision of Japan and what apprenticeship life would be. And slowly during the course of that year, that got grinded down and worn out of me. So by the end of that first year, I was fed up. It wasn't so much that I was fed up with being an apprentice. It was more being fed up with the cultural elements of Japan. Coming from the U.S., where everything is big and wide and big open spaces, and people have room to move around. Everybody's got their own kind of large personal bubble. Moving to a place like Japan, where it's basically the landmass size of California, with a third of the population of the entire United States jammed in it, was completely different. You're living on top of one another. There's some really cool cultural elements that I now recognize as great things that emerge because of that proximity to so many people all in one space. But at the time, I was fed up with it. It was impossible to make friends. It was hard to interact with people, despite the fact that my language skills were improving at that point. Part of it too was that it was really hard to make friends outside of the nursery because I was always at the nursery. It was 7 days a week. You might get one day off a month. During the busy season, it could be 2, 3, 4 months sometimes between days off. So it's not like you had a lot of opportunity to go out and meet people. And I think that's actually a big issue for a lot of people, particularly foreigners who come to Japan to do a bonsai apprenticeship. We all have this really romanticized vision of what apprenticeship life is going to be like. The ability to work on the best trees in the world and to learn from the best artists in the world. It's great, and I think everybody recognizes it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a mental and physical marathon, but I don't think people fully recognize those cultural differences, and it's really hard to recognize them before you go and to be able to understand them and to know what to expect. Because you can read any number of books on Japanese culture, but they don't really get to the essence of the human interaction component of Japanese culture, and it's impossible to explain up front. We're going to get into some of these discussions throughout the course of this podcast, but they're very difficult to fully explain and divulge. So to know that before you go to Japan and to really understand what you're getting yourself into culturally, it's nearly impossible to understand. So I think a lot of folks from the West who come to Japan to do an apprenticeship, that first year they've got this romanticized vision of what it's going to be like. Over the course of that first year, that wears off, and then you're left with this sort of hollow shell of an experience. And I think that's why a lot, or a majority, of people from Western countries who go to Japan to do apprenticeships end up quitting after about a year and a half to 2 years, somewhere in that range. So it's the folks that have powered through that and completed a full 5-year apprenticeship are few and far between. So I feel lucky that I was able to do that. And for me, it was a combination of Fujikawa-san's attitude towards me. He wanted me to succeed, so he wanted me to stay on as an apprentice. So that was a major part of it. And the other part, too, was a support system that I had with my wife, Nancy, who was just living, a few miles away up in Kyoto. So I did have her to kind of back me up there, too. And she had actually, as I mentioned earlier, she had been a 4-year student at Ritsumeikan. So she had lived there for quite a number of years when I started my apprenticeship, at least 5 years at that point. So she had kind of become fully ingrained in the culture there. And actually, by the time we left Japan, she had lived there for almost 15 years, pretty close to it, 14, 15 years. So, by the time I started my apprenticeship, I did have that support system there. And I think that had a lot to do with my success in completing my apprenticeship at Fujikawa-san's nursery. So back to the 3-month trial period that I had. I mentioned earlier that Fujikawa-san did not want to provide me a visa when I got there. So what we did is, I got there, I got into the swing of things, and really sort of found my groove during the first month and a half or so. And at that point, Fujikawa-san agreed to apply for the visa for me. And I was ecstatic at that point. I thought, this is great. I'm going to be an apprentice. We're going to do this for 5 years. This is going to be amazing. So we went to the immigration office. We went through the whole process of applying for a Bunka Katsudo visa, which is a cultural studies visa. So for folks who are in Japan studying a cultural art, it could be tea ceremony, it could be bonsai, it could be ikebana, any number of things. So we applied for the visa, and they told us it was going to take probably about a month or so to receive the visa if everything went well. So we applied at that 6-week mark, and I had a total of 90 days. So that was about halfway through that 90-day period, and they said it would take about a month. So I figured, okay, I'm going to have a couple of weeks of leeway at the end. Well, we get to the end of the 90-day period, and I still haven't gotten anything back about my visa. On the 91st day, I got a letter from the immigration office. They said, your visa is ready. Come down to the office, and we'll give that over to you so you can stay for a full year. So we went down to the office, handed my paperwork over to the officer there. He looked at it and noticed that I had gone over that 90-day period, and he said, you've broken the law here. So there are a few police officers that are waiting downstairs for you. They're going to take you directly from here to the airport. You have to get on a flight. You can't get any of your luggage. You have to leave this country, and you can't come back for 7 years. And at that point, I nearly burst into tears. My stomach just dropped out of me. My heart was up in my throat. I had no idea what to do. So luckily, Fujikawa-san was there with me. We spoke to the immigration officer. We had a back and forth with the guy. And he finally said, okay, look, I'm going to give you 2 hours. I want you to write me a 2-page essay on why I should allow you to stay in Japan. So Fujikawa-san and I left the immigration office, went to a cafe across the street, and thought very carefully for two hours as to what I should write. So we, of course, wrote, I'm here to study bonsai, a cultural art. I'm here to learn that so I can take it back to the U.S. and teach folks there about this deep Japanese art. So please let me stay. So we took that letter back over to the guy, gave it to him. He made us sit there for another 2 hours while he and his staff reviewed it. Finally came back out and he said, okay, I'm going to give you your visa, but don't ever do this again. So at that point, I could breathe again. I felt so good. But my career in bonsai, my apprenticeship was nearly over before it began. So I feel lucky that I was able to continue on for 5 or 6 years beyond that. So following that 3-month trial period, I ended up working at the nursery as an apprentice for a full, I guess it was about 6 years. Normally an apprenticeship in Japan is 5 years, and then you receive certification from the Japanese Bonsai Association, and then you give an extra year as a gift back to your oyakata or your teacher as a thank you for having allowed you to stay for so long. So that's exactly what I did. And then I ended up staying on 3 years beyond that, working as a professional in Japan. So I was actually the first and only, at the time, Western bonsai professional working in the Japanese bonsai professional community. So I did that for about 3 years. And then this year, my wife and I decided to relocate back to the US to start our own bonsai nursery. And that kind of brings me to the point where we are now. So we are based now in Nashville, Tennessee, and we're working on establishing and building our bonsai garden and nursery here. So for those of you who haven't seen my vlogs on YouTube, we're naming the nursery Eisei-en, which is, of course, a Japanese name. A translates to forever. Sei translates to green, and of course En translates to garden. So the nursery directly translates basically to evergreen garden. But each of those characters, the first two characters, they have multiple meanings. So that they can also be translated to forever young, forever having a young open mind about the future, always trying to transmit knowledge to the next generation. And then of course evergreen also implies always being successful in business. So there's multiple layers to the meaning of our new garden's name. Now, we haven't officially opened the garden yet. We will be opening in 2018. As of now, our official opening date, we're going to have a massive event later in the year, so I will be making announcements about that in future vlogs, so be on the lookout for that. We're also going to be offering intensive courses too. So, for those of you who are interested in checking that out, you can go to bjornbjornholm.com. I'll have all the information up there in the first quarter or second quarter of 2018. So that brings us to the end of this very first podcast. I hope that you guys understand kind of what I hope to accomplish with this podcast and a little bit more about my personal background in bonsai. Moving forward, we are going to be diving even deeper into those subjects and many, many more subjects. I'm going to be continuing to travel around the world in 2018, and I'll be interviewing folks from all different parts of the globe about their perspectives on bonsai art. In future podcasts, we are going to be doing a mailbag, so if you're interested in asking me questions or providing comments to me, you can send those to podcast@bjornbjornholm.com. I won't be able to address all of those in the podcast, but I will pick and choose a few here and there for each podcast, and we will get into that in the future. So once again, thank you so much for joining me on this new adventure, and I hope to see you guys next time. Take care.